Thanks for joining us Behind the Frontline, a video podcast providing timeless solutions to everyday workforce and workplace challenges. Frontline Training Solutions is an express employment professionals company, strategically placed between the workplace and the workforce with professionals standing by, ready to combat your unique challenges. Learn more about what we do at frontlineon.com. Oh, hello again for our podcast, Behind the Frontline. And today we have a very special guest with us again. We have Kristin Ekkens, who is the CEO and founder of Exponential Inclusion. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself a little bit more in a second. If you aren't familiar with Kristin, go back and watch other podcasts. They're good for you. But we've had Kristin on before. We also have Nathan Leaman, who's the managing director for Frontline Training Solutions. And of course, I'm Nic Dampier, creative director here at Frontline. And Kristin, introduce yourself a little bit for those who are just tuning in for the first time.
Thank you, Nic. It's my pleasure to be here. As always, I just love having conversations with both of you. So as you mentioned, I'm Kristin, and my role at Exponential Inclusion is so interesting, changing, fascinating in every moment. Yes, CEO, founder, all of that. But truly, I call myself an chief inclusion designer. So I'm designing inclusion within spaces.
I like that.
Yes.
CID. Yeah.
CID.
Yeah.
And what we do, it's really about social impact. And so we've been iterating on what we've done in the past. So in the past, working with companies, going deeply in and figuring out how do we design inclusion and design inclusive spaces. And now it's actually taking it a step further and saying, how do we work with change makers all around the world? And those could be people within organizations or outside of organizations. So entrepreneurs, extrapreneurs, all of those people, but people who are changing fundamentally the world and creating inclusive futures for all. And so we solve some of the most difficult challenges around inclusion and belonging and culture that companies face.
Wow. That's amazing. And you're about to go on a hike.
Yes.
El Camino de Santiago.
It's a hike, I guess.
Experience.
Yes, it's an experiential. So I'm bringing some true, incredible change makers. So this group is a group of women, and we're coming from all different walks of life. We're going on El Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. So what it is, it's a pilgrimage. But it's not for us, it's not a religious pilgrimage, but you choose it as you want to choose it. It's a personal transformation. It's a spiritual transformation. It's a however each pilgrim takes it. But we're going there, and I'm going there bringing these women because, funny enough, it's about creating belonging for these change makers. We all find ourselves walking the edge every day as consultants, as coaches, as executives. And the challenges we find are often really lonely as we face them. So we come together even 4 or 5 months before the actual hike, our Camino starts. So we've been working together and physically keeping each other accountable because you have to prep for this. This is 72 miles that we're hiking in 6 days. But then we also are holding each other accountable in a mental way, a physical way, a spiritual way, and just coming together, making it happen.
Wow. So you're saying that in order to prepare for a hike like this and do it with excellence, you have to prepare well in advance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, I mentally started preparing for this personally about a year ago. And it was just more of a, because for me, it was an idea that came and I said, I did this 25 years ago. It's time to do it again, but I'm 25 years older now. So what do I need to do to prepare for this? But I had this feeling of, I need to do this. And whether I can get people to come with me or not, this has to be done. So it's my own personal journey as well that I'm taking while going on this.
How exciting.
I'm really excited for it.
That's
Yes.
so fun. All right. Well, today we are here to talk about belonging and onboarding, or a term that Nathan has coined.
Yeah.
BelongBoarding.
BelongBoarding.
Explain what BelongBoarding is.
BelongBoarding. Well, it is an interesting term. And every time we use it in groups, people are like, oh, that's good. So we thought, hey, let's build a podcast around this and talk more about it. At its essence, it's not a combination of belonging and waterboarding, taking that off the plate. It's belonging and onboarding. And it's really, how do we help people feel like they belong as quickly as possible in an organization that they're joining? And, a lot of organizations have orientation or onboarding programs. But we want to start to bring in this idea of belonging. That's why we wanted Kristin here to help us talk about that, because she's so much in that space. But how do we help people really feel that connection in their organization? When does that start? What are some best practices for organizations in order to be good at that? Why is it important? I know you've got some statistics that you're going to take us through. So I think in a nutshell, it's like, how do we help people feel that connection fast? Because we know that will hopefully translate into longer retention, better performance, more engagement, people being their authentic self. So that's how I would define it.
Yeah, I love that. And so, like Nathan said, we have a few stats. According to World Metrics, I'm going to nerd out for a second. So if you like stats too, you're going to love these. But according to World Metrics, up to 20% of employee turnover happens within the first 45 days of a new hire. 75% of companies currently using onboarding strategies to retain talent. And of those organizations with a standard onboarding process experience 50% greater new hire retention. 77% of employees who went through a formal onboarding process hit their first performance milestones. So we can see that from the data that onboarding well increases retention and productivity. So there's no question for a well-executed onboarding plan from day one. Some even best-in-class organizations are 35% likely to begin onboarding before day one, which kind of struck me as you're preparing for the hike before the hike.
Yes.
So some companies, even best-in-class, prepare for onboarding even before day one. And this concept of creating a sense of belonging in the onboarding process from day one. New hires who experience a sense of belonging are 34% more likely to be satisfied with their job and 69% more likely to stay with their company for 3 years if they experienced great onboarding and feel they belong. So my question is, first, what does belonging mean to you within the organization? And what are some effective strategies or practices that you've seen implemented that foster a strong sense of belonging through this onboarding process? Kristin, if you want to kick that off.
Absolutely. So I've always defined belonging as, one way is to look at it is a feeling, the feeling we have. And so Nate, you mentioned this, it's a feeling of connection. And I think that is very, very true. It's a feeling that we have. So if inclusion is an action, we can include others. We can get people to be involved, have their voice heard. Belonging is that feeling of walking in and saying, okay, is this where I should be? And you're asking yourself questions, maybe even without knowing that you're doing it, but your radar is on to figure out, do I feel okay here? Do I feel safe here? Do I feel like I can speak up and be myself here? And being in a place where you belong, think about, I was thinking about one of my sons is going into high school. High school is one of those places where you're trying to figure out where you belong.
It's true.
Right? And you think about that and compare it to the workplace. Same thing. When you first walk into a new workplace, you're trying to figure out as fast as possible, where do I belong here? Yes, I know what team I'm on, but who are the people that I'm connected to, should connect to, want to connect to? And I think Gallup even has it in one of their survey questions, the 12th one maybe, of who's your best friend at work. It's because that is going to determine how long they stay potentially. Do you have a quote unquote best friend at work? It doesn't have to be your best friend in life, right? But do you have someone that you feel like you can go to and maybe not share everything with, but at least when you have a hard day or a really weird interaction with someone, are you able to share with them, hey, I'm uncomfortable here. What should I do? Right. So you've got to feel connected. And that's where I think belonging really comes in.
Yeah. I love that.
I know a lot of organizations and people get frustrated with that question from Gallup. Like, come on, my best friend or whatever. But if you step back a second and say, what makes somebody a really close friend or quote unquote best friend? What are those attributes and characteristics? Then you start to say, okay, I get why they're asking that question. It's like what you said. I know who I can talk to. I know I can be authentic and myself with them. I enjoy their company. And I feel a connection, like we said. So it's a frustrating question sometimes for people on the survey, but there's a reason for it, and it really does make a difference. If they just went by what they got pushback on. They would have got rid of that question a long time ago, but they see it's important.
That's right. That's right. There's also something, so Brene Brown talks about belonging quite a bit. And I love how she looks at it. She actually talks about it, and I wrote this down too, about true belonging. And so there's belonging, and then there's a true belonging. And how she talks about that is actually you carry your belonging with you. And if you think about that, that's very profound, right? You carry your belonging with you, and it's letting a sense of being who you are lead you. So that's not her direct quote, but that's a summary of really what it's about. So that means me as a new employee coming in, being onboarded, I'm actually carrying my belonging with me. And there's a piece of confidence that comes along with that. There's a piece of knowing who I am. The challenge is so many people, from frontline workers all the way to executives, haven't figured that piece out.
Right.
So that's why we talk about the employer having to figure out how to help people belong, because the individuals are also still figuring out who they are and what their true innate capabilities are.
Yeah. It almost sounds like when you're talking about the idea of a best friend or a friend, you're really kind of describing, in essence, a mentorship as well. So what would you guys think about, mentorship as part of the onboarding process? I noticed that, from some major companies out there, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they really implemented from day one, like a buddy process or a mentorship process, just to kind of create that sense of belonging from day one. Yeah. What do you guys think?
Yeah. So when I think about onboarding, I have been using kind of this concept or idea of big O onboarding and little O onboarding. So I'll talk about the difference and then get to that question on mentoring. So big O onboarding to me is the stuff that organizations just have to do when somebody joins. And so it's paperwork. Got to get your W-4 or 9 or whatever filled out. You got to get your benefits selected, and you got to, here, let's go over the employee manual and make sure here's your keys. This is how you log in. These are all really important things, but it's almost compliance. It's like, we have to do this. Some of it, I have to do it for the government, or some of it we have to do for our internal process purposes. All right. And so people join the company and they got to figure all that stuff out. Little O onboarding to me is the onboarding that happens after that. It's the process of getting people connected, meeting their team. Do you have a sense for what your schedule looks like for the first couple of weeks, so you're not wandering around kind of lost? Mentorships or buddy kind of pairing up happens in, I think, best practice organizations pretty early on, but it's part of that longer term experience. The compliance side of onboarding, we got to get people paperwork and everything filled out probably the first morning they're there, right? And then the next period of time is that onboarding process. I worked at an organization a number of years ago where we basically took that second part of onboarding to 2 years. We basically laid out a 2-year plan of continual kind of exercises, check-ins, important things happening, and a buddy that you connect with for at least a year, and you have the opportunity to extend it for another year. And so those kinds of relationships, who can I go to outside of HR and my direct manager? Because there's some things that I don't really want to talk to them about, especially at first while I'm still building trust with them and understanding. And I might have some baggage around what HR is all about, So it's like, I only go to HR when something's really wrong or whatever, which isn't great, but that's the reality.
Sometimes the reality.
Right. So who can I connect with, and how can that person help me make additional connections and feel more a part of the organization? So I think it's important to kind of see these things, because we can conflate ideas and concepts for onboarding, orientation, whatever, new hire, whatever, because we're looking at the process side as well as the other stuff that I think we really want to focus on in this conversation.
Yeah, I would just add I've also been a part of organizations, actually 2 different ones that I'll talk about my own experience in onboarding in them. So I worked in HR in one of them. And then the other one, I was coming in, actually was working in a different state, but I lived in a different one. So a remote worker. And it was very interesting how the onboarding was set up, but it was actually one of those things that I would say the onboarding started way before I started even being a part of the interview process.
Nice.
The onboarding itself is actually, in my mind, it's connected to the DNA of the organization and how the cultural values are actually not just spoken about, but lived out in lived experiences that people have. So this is why for the strategy, the buddy system is actually incredibly helpful. Yet that should actually be a part of the interview process, or allowing people, and this is one of the leading practices, allowing people to see and experience before they make a decision for the employee and for the employer to see, is this actually the lived experience that I'm looking for as well? So it goes way back all the way to how are the cultural values showing up? How are the values of the organization? How are the behaviors of all the other workers around me actually portraying those values? So that's super important, because for one, so my own example of this, I went into one of the organizations, they gave me a buddy, and that was incredibly helpful because I had already asked the difficult questions knowing I was coming into a culture that was in transition. So I already had taken, okay, I know this is not going to be easy. So it's on me because I made that decision, that choice to still go in. But I still need to know who to connect with.
Yeah.
I still need to know, I'm remote, which most of us are. So we have to know how to connect virtually with the right people at the right times. So I had an incredible, helpful buddy. But one thing I will say, mentor versus buddy. So for me, I think mentoring is always about cross-mentoring. I don't think there's a one-way mentor system, or there shouldn't be, because no matter what age we are, what roles we have, we are learning from that other person. And so even that person coming in actually could be mentoring the person that's there. So they have these fresh ideas, these new ways of looking at what's always been. And so if people can look at it as a co-created journey from the start, that's where actually belonging starts to be created.
Wow.
Yeah, I really like that. And it goes back to earlier conversation about, do people even themselves understand belonging for themselves? So who do you pick to be those buddies / mentors? Have they, a lot of organizations are probably going to look at, well, are they aligned to our values? Are they a good performer? Do they get along with people well? Would they be a good ambassador for us? But I would add other things like, are they learning themselves? Are they open? Are they willing to share feedback with the powers that be in the organization about what the belonging process or onboarding process looks like? So you want somebody that can be that advocate for the new hire, for the organization, and really put together kind of an overall experience that's really helpful. But that also means that they've kind of figured out that belonging thing themselves a bit, I would think, in order for them to be able to foster that with other people.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned, Kristin, about the pre-onboarding and kind of becoming a part of the culture and DNA of the company. And it really got me thinking about the cost of onboarding well. I actually pulled some stats on it. According to Allied HR IQ, 4 out of 5 companies don't have a specific budget for onboarding, and 1/3 of them actually spend $0 on onboarding. Whatever the reason may be, in your opinions, should companies set aside line items for onboarding well and belonging, set aside that budget for it, which I know can be, onboarding well and belonging apart from each other can be 2 different things. But in this sense, should companies make a budget for this a priority to increase their retention rates and reduce potential turnover?
Well, I put it this way. Whenever there's an issue of cost, there's always 2 sides to the equation. There's the cost if you do, and there's the cost if you don't.
Yes.
Correct.
So whether you are setting aside dollars specifically for it or not, you kind of are, whether you realize it or not. So I do think an organization needs to think intentionally about the experience that people have when they start, and what are those things that might cost some dollars but go a long ways towards helping people feel welcome. It's not the whole answer, but do they get some sort of gift the first day, swag, right? A lot of organizations I know and that I've been a part of, like first day, we're taking care of lunch for you, and it could be a team lunch or it could be just the manager and you. Because that's also a big question you have is, do I bring food? And if I bring food, where do I put my food until it's time to eat the food?
Or what restaurants are nearby?
Yeah. What's the options that you could have or whatever? But so however that's tracked, I think the organizations that do it really well probably do have some sort of line item or budget associated with it. But I think the bigger question is, are you looking at those little things that yes, they cost some money, but they can go a long ways. And then if you're doing a buddy thing, what does the buddy have the option of doing?
Right.
Is it just, we're going to meet for half an hour once a month in some, windowless conference room and talk? Or do they have the option of, hey, let's go get a coffee, let's go do this or whatever? Is that something that you should potentially consider? I would say, yeah.
There's, many things are running through my mind with this. It's the first thing though is about, we're all humans. And so as we come into this and truly thinking about what would someone else, what would I want?
Yeah.
So if I'm not the one coming in, but I'm actually established in the organization, and just saying like, what would I want if it were my first day? Or let me go back to that very first day, right? And so starting to think through, how would I have felt like I would belong even faster than I did? And sometimes it is the swag that helps people say like, oh, I've got pride in who I'm working for now, right? I can display this. Sometimes that backfires. Sometimes you can get way too much swag.
Another cup to add
and
to my...
Here we go. What are they trying to do through marketing with me? But at the same time, I think it's more about these personalized gestures. And for some people, that means time spent, like you were saying, right? Do I get half hour a month? That's money too. That a resource that companies are saying, yes, we'll invest in other employees is time to do that. And at the same time, I think giving something does show them, because especially if they're remote, versus in person, what's that sense that I can feel the organization right here in my space as well. So sometimes that's important to have something to look at and say I'm a part of them as well. So I think it kind of depends where you are, where you're located, but also just in general, you won't know how every human wants to be treated and what makes them feel like they belong.
Yeah.
So try a few things. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah. I've got actually an interesting story about the swag thing. So I was at a previous employer and they did this thing yearly where they would do some sort of gift to the entire organization, about 1,200 people. It was just in their DNA and they've been doing it for years. And this particular year, they gave away Yeti coolers to all 1,200 people, which is not a small investment.
No, that's not.
Know, a few $100,000 kind of thing. So, and there was a few individuals that started the day that giveaway occurred. And we had a conversation in human resources because we were responsible for kind of coordinating all this stuff. And the question came up, well, the new hires, they're just here. We don't even know if they're staying very long or whatever. And it was not even a long conversation. It was absolutely they're a part of this experience. So think about the message that sends to somebody who starts that day and they're included in this thing that's been ongoing for a long time. And I got a Yeti cooler today. Yeah. Now, the funny thing was, just funny side story, some people didn't know what the Yeti coolers were. So they're like selling them to other people for like $30 or something like that. It's like, wow. So maybe they just didn't need a cooler or whatever. But for those new hires, people just starting to be a part of that experience with everybody, because there's like a set time to go pick yours up and whatever. that I think sent a huge message of you are a part of us, even though this is your first day. And so it gets to a little bit of the mindset of how do you even think about your new hires? You go back to some of the statistics that you talked about earlier, 40% or whatever leave within the first 3 months or a month and a half. I mean, if you're thinking, well, 4 out of 10 people probably aren't going to be here, that changes how you think about your new hires. And you could be unconsciously segregating them out or looking at them differently, treating them differently because you're just so burned by the fact that so many people have left. It's like, we'll see.
Yeah.
No, it's not we'll see. They are there. They're a person. Let's get them integrated and belonging as fast as we can and not look at them as a separate group of people.
Absolutely. I go back to that high school example because what I don't love is, we have these naturally categories of freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, right? And the seniors, so I have a son who's going to be a junior and then another that's freshman. And it's like, oh, it's the freshmen. They're coming in. They're brand new. They know nothing. It's like, well, yeah, but no. If we think about employees too, they're not coming from nothing.
Right.
Even if it was their first job, they're still coming with experience of something. And so I think being able to see immediately they are contributors immediately. Right?
Yeah. I think there's this idea that, someone's a new hire. There's almost like this newborn baby. Like I got to grow them in the image of the company. Well, that's not true. They have experience of their own. They have so much wealth of knowledge,
That's right. The culture does too shapes and changes as you bring in new employees. And this is why, you look at, if you bring in a number of new employees at once, you're bringing a number of individual cultural values, the way people see the world and differences in that. And you try to figure out now, how do we move and shape? Because even country cultures, they don't stay the same. They change. They move and change over time as generations come up. Companies are the same microorganism in a sense that they move and shape and they have to change. So when we look at, okay, bringing people in, how do we welcome also the values that they have that may be slightly different from ours? Yeah. Right. And this is where if they feel like it's too different, that's when within the 90 days, or 45 days even, like, nope, I'm out.
Yeah, I got a question. So I love what you said about the culture ever changing, especially if you bring in a huge influx of new hires, then potentially that culture of belonging could look different next year than it did last year.
Yes.
And so let's think about ownership of the belonging culture. What role should leadership play in this belonging culture and onboarding process? And who should that model, like that culture DNA, be modeled after? Should it be leadership or should it be the hires?
Both and.
Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah.
So in my mind, it's the executives are role modeling what they want to see from everyone else. But so are the managers and so are any individual contributors. They're all role modeling what they want to see from their coworkers. And so it's every single person has the ownership of creating belonging within an organization. And every single person has ownership for, even if the buddy system is not a formal system. I had this at one company. It was an informal system. But that meant belonging was in the culture in some ways already because
it was happening.
It was happening. And I had someone come up to me and we were colleagues. I maybe was a manager level, him an individual contributor, but at the same time, he said, hey, can I take you out to lunch? Like, I'd love to get to know you more and show you around, tell you who you need to meet here, things like that. And I was like, that is just so kind of you. You're spending your own time, not getting paid, but being paid, but he has to get all of his other things done too, right? To bring me on and help me belong. So,
yeah, I think that's a really good second kind of practical example. We talked about the buddy process. We talked about being willing to reach out. I'd like to hear any other practical things. I have some thoughts too, but like, what can an organization do to foster belonging in the onboarding process? Do you have some more specific thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, the absolute first one is the buddy, because that creates the connection. I would say, the second one when I think through, we go through all the tactical pieces, like we mentioned, the what'd you call it? The
Big O and
Big
little
O.
Big O onboarding. Yeah.
Big O,
All the
little O.
compliance stuff. Yeah.
That's right. You're going through all of that, but then that next piece is getting into the work itself.
Yeah.
And I would say figuring out just expectations around that. It's huge to figure out and aligning with expectations with your own boss, your manager, your leader. And so to feel like you belong, it's establishing even these one-on-ones right off the bat with your leader. It's being able to figure out, okay, how and when will I be connecting with this person? What's expected of me? And then having these check-ins, especially in the onboarding phase, more frequently than you might even after that. It's just critical, those expectations and being aligned.
Yeah.
I think when they're misaligned, or when the new person coming in feels they don't have any feedback, they don't know if what they're doing is the right thing. If am I showing up the way that I'm supposed to be showing up? That is where people feel like, I don't belong here. I have no clue what's happening. I'm gone.
For sure.
So I think that's another thing, making sure strong connections. And I like to call this actually, if you think about an organization as a network with nodes, it's the levers that you're pulling, and these lines in between these nodes are about the actions and the circumstances people are in. Some of those lines or the levers are dotted lines. And I think of when people come in as onboarding, it's almost a dotted line first, because you don't know, who should I trust here? Is my manager someone I can trust? Is my colleague someone I can trust? Who is it? So it's starting almost with a dotted line that you've got to keep working on to create this dark, solid line.
Yeah, I like that. I think about also, like, what are the meetings or normal cadence of business operations, whatever your team is doing, that they should be included in? And who's responsible for making sure that happens? So in an organization that does onboarding and belonging well, they're very intentional about getting that stuff on their calendar, right? So don't show up at a team meeting and wonder where the new person is, because nobody added it to their calendar or invited them or told them it was happening.
Yes.
Right.
And it's a great point.
And the fact of the matter is, we're all running a million miles an hour. These are just normal parts of our experience. We know that every Wednesday morning at 8:15, we do this. Well, somebody's got to take the time to make sure that person knows. Bring them along. And then that first time they're in that meeting, do you go right into business? Or do you take a minute to acknowledge that this person is new, and you do a little bit of that forming of the team, because it's different now.
It is.
And you've got to be intentional with that. So every time those kind of interactions are occurring, especially the first couple of times, what kind of acknowledgement are we going to do? Are we just going to plow into it? And they're trying to figure out, how do I fit? Who are these players? Who's doing what? Or are you more intentional about laying that out for them?
I would add an example to that that's right on point. Time zones are critically important if you're working across time zones and onboarding someone.
Yeah. Remote onboarding.
Interesting.
We haven't even
Here's a
really
meeting
dove into
at
remote onboarding
my
yet.
goodness.
4 a.m.
So I will say, one of my experiences being onboarded, I was sitting there twiddling my thumbs for 3 hours until offices opened at noon for me, 9 a.m. for them. And I was like, am I still employed? What's happening?
Yeah.
Like,
Did
I don't
I
have
miss
my
a
computer
memo?
yet. And I'm sitting here and I feel like I should be doing something, but I've got nothing to do. Don't know what I should be doing.
Oh, wow.
It was really interesting. So I think that's the case too, where you have to be, the point person is critically important. And I had one, and he was incredible, but he was told, Kristin starts on this day. So then, of course, he reached out on that day when he started work that day. But it's like, it has to start even before that,
Right.
depending on time zones and all of that. Just if I had known the Friday before, hey, you're still like good to do nothing until noon your time.
Yeah. It's a lot of extra work for that person who might be that point person, but think about like the impact that it would have if that person showed up to work having their answers, like their questions answered.
Yes.
Like all of their unknowns, uncertainties, like answered on day one. Like how much more productive or in tune might they feel?
And I think one of the ways you can figure those questions out even proactively is to do some sort of reflection with relatively new employees.
Yes.
Like, what was your experience like what worked when you were onboarded? Where did you get stuck? What do you think we should do differently?
Yeah.
So how are you getting that real-time feedback? I know organizations will do surveys of new hires after a certain amount of time. What was it like? What worked? We've done it too, different organizations where we've reflected with managers who are being trained. There may be new managers, and we think about, okay, here's how you onboard a new employee. But before we talk about that, what was it like when you first started? Just getting your manager, direct line is such an important relationship to think about what their experience was like. Just slow them down long enough to figure that out and say, oh, I don't want that to happen. Or I really want to make sure this happens because it was really helpful for me.
Right.
So what can, organizations can do this regularly, kind of figure out what's working and real time adjust as needed.
Yeah. I've seen some, even organizations adopt something like a 30, 60, 90 day check-in, like the interview with their new hires.
That's right.
Absolutely. It makes me think, though, of something with designing for belonging. So being intentional about that. So figuring out exactly who and how are we designing this for, and jumping in and saying, okay, if I'm designing this, then exactly what you're saying, like where might people feel uncomfortable in this? Where is their disconnect? And I think it's important to also ask those, not just where did you feel like you belonged, but the opposite side of it, and where was their disconnect happening?
Right.
But this book here, so this is, we can't go through in this podcast all of the strategies and things like that, but Stanford D School puts out this little guide called Design for Belonging. And so even just that mindset shift of thinking about how designing, being intentional, designing for belonging before someone gets there and while they're there and through the employee life cycle up until the exit interview. Maybe they have decided to leave and it's 90 days or 45 days. You still want them to experience the organization in a way that you're designing for belonging, right? How can they feel, even though they've decided to leave, that they still can potentially have a home there if that's what you choose to say, or just saying like, hey, I know this wasn't exactly the place for you, but we're grateful you were here for that period of time.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe that's not the case for everyone, but I think just being intentional and designing for it allows you to think through it more specifically.
Yeah. Do you want to show that to the camera for those who are watching?
Designing for belonging.
Can you see it here? No?
Yeah.
This one? This camera?
Whichever
Camera?
all the cameras.
Every camera?
All the cameras.
Yes.
I think that's good. Even in terms of someone as they made the decision to leave and you are showing them that they still belong, that they still matter, that, their presence is still important. What we've seen is, get them a goodbye gift. They decided to leave, but get them a goodbye gift. Let them know that you're going to miss them, that they're important to you.
Yes.
If that is the case.
Right.
I hope it is. So
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've been telling folks, and I think we've said this in a few of our webinars, but people are not your employees until they decide to stay. And that is going to potentially be a long term, could be, a weekend. Yeah, this is the place for me. And they start to identify that I feel like a part of this. Could be 30, 60, 90 days, could be 180 days or whatever. So an organization, I think we just need to recognize, especially as of late, people have, it seems like options, and a lot of organizations, your best recruitment strategy is to be a place where people can belong and be engaged and be retained. So how do you think, Kristin, about the duration of onboarding? Like, what does that look like for you from even a belonging perspective? I think some people might say it never ends. So curious what you think about that.
I do think those first 90 days, according to the stats, the 45 and 90 days, those are critical, right? And just technically speaking, before the 90 days, there's a lot less of the big O stuff, that the compliance things that it's like, okay, so we want to make sure though, within those 90 days. So I think the intense amount of work, making sure that someone feels like they belong during that time, that they have a place. So it's not just, in a sense, the feeling in the buddy, but it's my work that I bring here is important and that I'm valued here and what I can contribute is valued here. And so it will take a lot more intense work. Think about any relationship that you have, a new relationship. In the first part. I mean, we laugh about this, like, my husband and I have been married for 21 years, but that courting took 7 years.
Yeah.
But we did start dating in high school.
Yeah,
so I will say, way back, but at the same time, it's like the courting took a while. And I think of it as that courting relationship. But once they get married or they've decided to stay after the 90 days, this is something, it doesn't end. My husband still sends me flowers, still does those things to show that he values me, that I'm important. And I think that's critically important. The same for employees, that they still get a Yeti sometimes or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah. Now, I'd love to hear your take on when that's not done the appropriate way, because a lot of companies will approach those kind of situations with false promises or pizza parties, or
It feels inauthentic, right?
it feels inauthentic. In fact, I have a meme, and I'm going to show you guys. I didn't know if I was going to play it or not, and I'll put it on the camera. But
There we go. The drinking that fever. Here you go, fever. You're drinking the juice.
Wow.
it's just a silly little meme, but it's kind of true. I mean, some companies will just kind of throw like false promises at them, or a pizza party.
That's the waterboarding part of
That's the
BelongBoarding.
corporate torture.
Yeah.
Think about, though, if you're going to erode trust, what would you do? You tell them things, you pour Kool-Aid down their throat right away, false promises, all of these things that you don't stand up to what you're going to say. Your integrity doesn't show through. That would be the fastest way to make it not a dotted line, but erase the whole line. So I think, that meme is a great way to show it.
Silly.
Yet at the same time, some people might still just stay on for a while. They may say like, oh, well, I get a pizza party here and there. That's fine. And there's nothing against pizza, but I will say, I mean, that can open up a whole nother conversation, but allowing for people to have their different ways, it's almost about individuality along with the collective. And where my mind first went, whenever someone says, hey, we're gonna have a pizza party, I bring my own lunch.
Right, exactly.
Not
Not
a fan of
everybody can
pizza.
eat
I'm
pizza.
gluten and dairy free. Pizza is not part of my, so it's like, okay, that's fine. And then it's like, okay, now all of a sudden I have to think through. But I would say I'm confident in that. I've been that for 10 years. So to me, it doesn't matter. But when I first started, it was like, is it going to be okay if I bring my lunch? Is there going to be a place for me to warm it up? That same thing that you were saying earlier, right? But it's like, not to say people can't have pizza parties and not to say you have to cater to every single individual, but it is about thinking about, are you always offering only pizza parties? Because then you've left people out.
Yeah. How what would you say is a good way to measure, engage that feedback? I mean, we've done interviews before on stay interviews, and what would you say are effective ways to get that feedback from employees, both new hires and veteran hires?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to what I said a little bit earlier, doing regular check-ins. You talked about 30, 60, 90s. Just being very intentional about getting that regularly is important. I think another way to measure goes back to what Kristin was mentioning earlier with the Gallup, whether you use Gallup's Q12 or some other engagement or culture survey. Regular conversations with your team are important as well. And sometimes people are comfortable sharing in a team and sometimes they aren't. So just how are you connecting one-on-one? I think about an individual manager's span of control. You can say, oh, I can't influence the whole organization. No, you can influence your team. And so meet with your people and understand where they're at. I think there's a lot of things organizations can do to get that feedback, very formal ways and also informal ways.
I would agree. And I mean, what came through my mind too in that moment is you will have some people that feel much more attached to the culture immediately and are used to the ways that you ask for feedback, is trying it out in different ways to get feedback in multiple different ways.
That's good.
Right. So one might be that Yeah, we're going to ask for in our suggestion box. There might be, hey, directly to the manager, just send a little thing, but maybe that's not comfortable. Maybe there's an anonymous, actually, I've seen even hackathons done in the space. So an organization does an anonymous hackathon that everyone can put, you can do it in Miro, in Mural. There's a lot of different collaboration tools that people can just add sticky notes and be that visiting elephant. Right? No one will see who's left it. Yes. Yeah. And so to be able to put that in and just say, hey, and give prompts to what will make it most effective and helpful. So it's not a complaining session either, but we're trying to make this better. Right? So figure out different ways to gather information from all different ways of thinking and being and doing.
Based on both of your experiences, you both are assessment gurus. Are there any assessments that you know of that companies could take their entire staff through to kind of gauge that 360 feedback, or what do you think?
Yeah.
I know Kristin's got a few
I do.
at the tip of her tongue.
I do. I'm excited to talk about it. Well, I think actually in the last webinar I did with you all that I showed some examples of this, but it actually it's a culture benchmark. And so it's called inclusive culture benchmark. And you can do it, 4 times a year, twice a year. It's not painful. It's a pulse survey in a sense, but it allows people to see the drive of the organization, the inclusivity, belonging, and safety. And as I mentioned from the beginning, safety is a critical piece of belonging. Right. So to be able to see how these all connect together, you can hear from employees throughout and see how it changes. And then you can see, let's say I start implementing some new onboarding techniques for helping to aid with belonging. Is there an uptick when you give this the next time? And so you may not be able to say exactly why it happened, but you can say, well, these are some of the initiatives we took and we've seen the culture now shift.
Okay, so you can measure it.
You can measure it. You can. And the individuals themselves too, they can take their own personal metrics, a dashboard that they have access to, and see where they are and then compare it with others. So this is where you can see, if you look at it this way, where the challenges are. Is it actually coming? Because you can look at it from teams. You can look at it from leadership perspectives, slice it in different ways, all confidential, but be able to say, well, actually our frontline teams are pretty bonded and they're actually doing really well staying connected and have strong personal communication keys, but we're seeing a gap with our leadership. And so then this is when okay, after the onboarding happens, where can we focus some of our efforts for learning, for development, for growth, for our employees, our leaders, wherever it might be. So it's targeted rather than just, let's splash it out there and try these things. You can say, how can we actually move the needle to solve for this challenge?
Yeah, I really like that example. It's very specific to the content of what we're talking about today. I would also talk broadly about if you're an organization that uses assessments in general, and I don't care really which one it is, but we use DISC with a lot of organizations, StrengthsFinder, Working Genius, other tools. How you approach using assessments will say a lot about your reflection on belonging as well. So if you have from a DISC perspective, a strong S culture, you start to kind of shun the D's, like, oh, wait, it's like I just can't handle them, or vice versa. So do you create an environment where one style is so preferred and so obvious that you're actually excluding people? Yeah. That can happen in organizations that use assessments a lot. It's a very easy trap to fall into. You're learning a bunch about yourself. You realize, hey, we're all really similar. Well, surprise, surprise, because you've been hiring each other for all this time. and you like people that are like you, but I know from my own experience that people who are different from me add so much to the plate that I can't do. And we need that perspective. So as an organization, if you're a big assessment culture, how you use it, how you talk about it, is really important to consider as well for belonging.
And I think that for someone to feel valued, when a newcomer may be the one that's saying like, oh, that's interesting that you do it this way. right? And they may say it kindly,
Fresh eyes, right?
fresh eyes, but they may be thinking, what is happening here? And so giving them space and that safety is critical for that, for them to say like, so I've experienced it this way, or have you ever tried it this way? And if the culture, meaning most of the people around them say like, we don't do it that way, or we tried it that way and it never worked, so we're not going to try it again. I guarantee you they will be thinking of an exit strategy.
Yeah, it's happened to me. That is my number one biggest thing I hate hearing within any company is that's just the way we've always done it.
Yes.
I always challenge it and I say, do better.
That's right.
Like you can do better.
Yeah. If you've always done it that way, think about how times have changed, how within the last 4 years, 5 years, technologies have changed. They're exponential right now. So if you're saying that, you find yourself saying that, well, because we've always done it this way, and you mean it in the positive light, it's like, you should critically think about that might be an issue.
Yeah. This all actually, I've been having this thing circle in my mind as we've been talking about organizational values and the role they play in underpinning all of this, right? So this particular issue, if something around innovation or looking at things differently or being inclusive, something baked into your DNA through your values, I think that will set up organizations really well for belonging or potentially not.
Yes.
And so I'd be interested in your thoughts, Kristin, a little bit about organizational values, the role they play in creating a belonging culture, because, a lot of organizations have them.
Yes.
They're using them in their interview process and in their performance process and potentially in promotions and all that. And it's like, if you don't have maybe the right ones or you haven't refreshed them lately, this could be an opportunity. It could also be a roadblock for belonging.
It's true.
So, the one thing that I thought of earlier, connected to the assessments, because this is where it's hard, because people say, oh yeah, we're living out these values.
Right.
And this is why they keep pushing them forward. Well, unless they have data that shows them they're not living values, often they'll say, we're living it. And it could be qualitative data, but it could be quantitative too. So that same assessment I was talking about, it's actually called mesh diversity. And if anyone's interested in that, they can feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help figure out what it looks like. But that data, I can actually put in the cultural values of an organization and then compare it to the individual metrics. It's all based on emotional intelligence and behavior. If they're not aligned and if it's not showing, it will show whether they're behaving in the way that they want to in terms of their values. I think that is critically important, along with the qualitative data that you can gather from employees across the board. So, but it sets the foundation for it. Some of the buzzwords out there that you used all of the time in values, they're putting these values out there as we want to reach these.
Yes. Yeah. More aspirational.
Right. Rather than the lived values that are in the organization. Aspirational values aren't bad.
Right.
But they also need to be stated as that.
Yeah.
If they state them as these are our current values and how we live them out, that's where you're going to have separation happen more quickly.
For sure. For sure. That's a really interesting, I hope people will take you up on that opportunity with mesh diversity, because it's like a gut check of whether or not we actually are who we say we are.
Yes.
And we might think we're better at this whole thing than at BelongBoarding than we really are, because there's values things that are maybe getting in the way and we don't even know it.
That's
kind of
right.
unconsciously.
That's right. And our own personal values play into it as well. I mean, all of these things play into it and how we interact with each other. And I think that's just a piece of, there's going to be a natural progression. There will be people that leave. There's no way that any organization can create a space that people won't leave before 45 days or 90 days, right? All the different circumstances that are there. Yet at the same time, if your intention is to bring on the best talent and to bring on talent that connects with your ethos in your organization and to support them in their work, then it's, do all that you can, because it also, as you mentioned before, and with the stats, so much money goes into, even if you're not paying for their onboarding
Right.
swag.
Right.
The amount
There's a
of
cost.
there's a huge cost to companies to lose their employees right away.
Right.
The last thing I'll say about that, though, is there are certain people that will come in, and these are often they're labeled as disruptors, or they're labeled as, and that's the negative way to label them. I like to call them change makers.
Yeah.
So this is often who I'm working with right now, are people who actually might go, they're not against the grain of the organization, but they see things differently in the organization than most other people do. This is why they're called change makers, and we call them edge walkers otherwise, right? They are seeing things that other people can't see. They're actually very special team members, but they get chewed up really fast because they're the ones saying like, well, have you ever tried this? Or have you ever seen it this way? Or let's think about this in a different way, or how might we? And they start asking questions where people feel uncomfortable. And that could be in the onboarding process, or once they've already said, okay, I've made it through here, I'm an employee here. Those are the people that you want, because they will create more spaces of innovation. They will actually create different kinds of belonging for those within the organization. So a lot of the work that I have been doing is creating belonging spaces for them, whether it's in the organization itself, a community in the organization, or a community outside of that they can join others to feel like they belong somewhere so that you can keep and retain them even longer.
So good. Yeah. I'm even part of communities outside the organization to
Absolutely.
bounce ideas off of. And
Absolutely.
yeah, that's great. It kind of brings my mind to a webinar that we're about to do on staying employers of choice and the idea of storytelling around your employer brand and kind of building that up. And even I think another way to help people feel they belong is tell their story.
Yes.
You know, especially the ones who are super bought in and really feel like they belong, like tell their story, attract other people.
I love that as an example of it. It's one company I worked for, they had hashtag my why.
My why. Okay.
And it was very effective. And this was for people who had been there, but you can do it for anyone. People who are just coming in, people who have been there, but it's a way to get to know people within the organization. And it was an incredibly effective, let's call it campaign.
Sure.
But truly what it was about employee experience. And at the heart of it, though, was about belonging. It was about, this is my why I'm here. This is why I am showing up, my purpose, why I'm spending my time here, why I might not be with my family, but here instead, my why and what I'm contributing. And so it also allows it to open up a space, because again, going back to what we talked about earlier, every person owns belonging. And back to what Brene Brown said, is true belonging. It's actually looking at your true self, and you're carrying your sense of belonging with you.
Right.
So that's a piece of all of it, being willing to share. And even if it's not a safe space, figuring out, is it safe enough that I can be the one to take the intentional action to create the straight, strong line rather than dotted? Even as a new employee in the space, show up for how you want to be seen as well.
Yeah. The whole telling your story thing is going to then go back to the onboarding experience before people even start, or even before they apply, because they're seeing, oh, this is a place
That's right.
that supports this person's story, and that resonated with me or whatever. So organizations who are good at that, I think, set themselves up for that BelongBoarding experience even before someone knows that there's an opportunity there and does the interview process. So
Yeah. Oh, I'm fired up. This is exciting. So we need to land this plane. So final takeaway on the idea of BelongBoarding and creating a culture of belonging. And I even know that there's probably some people listening to this and just thinking like, oh, this is not a problem for us, or shouldn't invest in this, or like, why bother? You know, what's your final takeaway, Kristin?
I would say for those who are feeling that way, like, oh, we've nailed this already, we've got it. Things are shifting and changing. So I would say never feel that comfortable.
Don't get too cozy.
Don't get too cozy with it. Just always be thinking intentionally, how do we do this even better? Be looking for those leading practices that are out there. And I'll say, I mean, you referred back to Google and to some of the other big ones that have been known to be doing it really well. They are feeling the shift and change. People are leaving there too. I mean, this is the culture we're in right now of employee and workplace culture. So just be intentional about how you're figuring out creating spaces that are inclusive and spaces for belonging for others.
Mm-hmm. So great.
Yeah, and I'll build a little bit off of that. I've been in the whole org development, leadership development space for 20 plus years. And I think organizations have been saying for a long time, this type of work around helping people feel this way, making sure our managers are equipped to help them feel this way. Organizations have been saying that's really important for a long time. It's mission critical now. And the demographic challenges that organizations are facing, the competitive challenges that organizations are facing, make this mission critical now. It's not an option, and you can't give it lip service anymore. It's really essential. If you're going to be around 5 years from now or 10 years from now, it's dependent on this work. So take some introspective thought and reflection, and it can be hard to see the things you need to see. But there's a journey in front of you that can actually really help the organization succeed long-term, even if it's one person at a time on their first day. That's really where it starts. So
that's so good. All these thoughts are so good. And, like both of these have said, there's going to be turnover. Like we're going to have turnover. Yeah. Things are going to happen. You may try this process and you may fail. All right. You may do it great, and then the next year fail again. There's going to be turnover. But I think the effort is really where the difference can happen, showing that you try and that you care and that this is important to you. And Frontline is here to help. Kristin with Exponential Inclusion is here to help. And so we want to talk to you. If you want to know more about creating an onboarding process where people feel they belong, or even some of the assessments we talked about, culture benchmarking or mesh diversity, we would love to connect with you. You can do so on frontlineon.com. We also have Kristin's contact information there in the bio of the podcast. We want to connect with you, and we want to help you stay and become employers of choice where people want to work there, and not just want to work there, but they want to stay there, decreasing your turnover and increasing your retention.
Awesome.
Right? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Kristin.
What a pleasure.
Thank you, Nathan. This is always fun. We'll see you next time on Behind the Frontline.